All right. Good morning and welcome to another episode of Deeper Talks. So my name is Marcus Horn. I'm kind of like quickly introducing our speaker today. But first, I want to say that afterwards we have a Q&A session. So following the presentation, and for our online audience, please use the question section there. And for those attending, obviously, just raise your arm. So this talk will be recorded using the same link as you got for the invitation. And of course, it will also be put on our website on the institute.serve/deeper talks. With that, I want to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Scott Beeler. He's a research scientist in the Engineering and Mining Experiment Station at South Dakota Mines in Rapid City. Dr. Beeler's research is focused on understanding the interaction and feedback between life and its environment on modern Earth, how these interactions have changed through Earth's history, and how these processes may be recognized on other planets. He received his PhD in Earth and Planetary Science from Washington University in St. Louis in 2019. With that, his talk is The Water Beneath Our Feet, Using SURF as Natural Lab of Groundwater Studies.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for everyone for giving me the opportunity to speak to you all today. I'm very excited to talk about some research we started about a year ago here, focused on trying to better understand what controls the geochemistry of groundwater at SURF, and also highlight why SURF is such a great place to be able to do this sort of research as well. Before I jump in too far, I'd just like to acknowledge a lot of people helped to make this research possible. So first, the South Dakota Space Grant Consortium who provided funding for this research. My collaborators on this project, including 2 undergraduate students, Reagan DeBoer and Riley Cordenbush, as well as Dr. Sarah Keenan at the School of Mines as well. And then just a huge shout out to all of the SURF staff who make this research possible. There's a huge team that really helps to facilitate doing all these cool things that go on at SURF. And I'll give a special shout out to the underground maintenance crew who kind of ferries us around and delivers us to all these sites and has provided some really interesting observations about how water in this system works. Okay, so to jump into it, I usually like to start my talks off with sort of a big picture of why you should care about this topic, and I think groundwater is one that's particularly easy to sort of describe. So groundwater is the largest terrestrial reservoir of liquid water on Earth, and so this plot on the left side of the screen that you can see here shows the size of different reservoirs of water on Earth. So if we talk globally, as most people are aware, oceans are where the bulk of this water is, but if we start to get into terrestrial or continental settings, this is a recent reappraisal of the size of these different reservoirs, and they actually found that these groundwater reservoirs outsize ice sheets and glaciers. If we're talking about just freshwater, in particular, ice sheets and glaciers are larger, but groundwater is a significant fraction of the freshwater that's available to us on Earth. And so this brings a lot of different uses for this water. For us as humans, it's a really important drinking water resource. So it's a drinking water source for around 140 million people in the US, myself included, and probably many of you who are local drink groundwater out here. Beyond drinking water, it also has important uses in other settings, such as agriculture and mining and other industrial uses. But beyond just human life, it's also home to a huge population of microorganisms that are incredibly diverse as well. So some estimates say that the terrestrial subsurface has up to 6 times 10 to the 29 cells. So that's a lot of zeros in a staggeringly huge number. And so it's sort of tough to estimate the total size of biomass on Earth, but regardless of how you look at it, this is a pretty significant amount of life on Earth that lives underground and does a lot of interesting things to survive in these settings. So I'm a biogeochemist in particular, as mentioned, so I like to think about how geochemistry and water is formed and how microorganisms interact with that geochemistry and all the feedbacks between these sorts of things. And so from a geochemical perspective, groundwater has a lot of key implications for our understandings of various processes. So as I mentioned, this is a large reservoir of water that includes a lot of life. So this is understanding these systems are important to understanding global biogeochemical cycling. So how are elements transformed as they move around the Earth? If we're talking about human uses, if we're going to drink water, we want to make sure there's nothing in it that's harmful to us as humans. So understanding what controls the geochemistry of these waters and how they evolve as they move spatially and how they evolve through time is important. Beyond drinking water, if we're going to use it for others, uses, some of these industrial uses I mentioned before, while we might be able to use water that we might necessarily want to drink, the geochemistry ultimately is what controls what we can use it for. So you could use a bunch of water that maybe is really salty and unpleasant for other uses to cool things down, but you might not want to pour it on your crops, for example. So understanding geochemistry is important for that. And then a big thing that really motivates my research is understanding this sort of microbial habitability aspect and how geochemistry controls where and how microorganisms can live, and then how microorganisms ultimately influence the geochemistry as well. And so this is what motivates NASA's interest in this, because these systems are sort of extreme environments that might serve as an analog for extraterrestrial environments. And so if we can understand how life lives in these settings, it can help us understand how life on other planets might live as well. And this is particularly important. There was a paper that came out a couple of months ago that suggested that there's active groundwater systems on Mars today. And so if there's microorganisms elsewhere in our solar system, that's a pretty likely place they might live. And so understanding how they live in this analog system that we can access on Earth really helps us to understand these settings as well. And many more, so things like carbon sequestration, where we're trying to put carbon from the atmosphere underground. Understanding the groundwater is ultimately what controls if we can keep that carbon underground and not have it leak back out into the atmosphere. Things like hydrochemical prospecting, so can we use water geochemistry to try and identify where different minerals of economic interest may be? This is important as renewed interest in developing new mining techniques in the United States to sort of shore up these supply chains for next generation battery technologies and other things. So if we want to understand groundwater geochemistry, we first need to understand all the different factors that may influence it and how these different factors interact with each other. So this is just sort of a cartoon diagram showing various things that might influence groundwater chemistry. So first and foremost, what's going to control this initially is what the water chemistry is like before it goes underground. So this recharged water chemistry. In most cases, recharged water is coming either from precipitation or surface runoff from rivers or streams or things like that. And so understanding what that chemistry is sort of your starting point. But once it goes underground, it starts to interact with a bunch of different other processes underground. So it's interacting with the rocks it flows over. So the geology will influence these things. So what are the rocks made of? What are the rocks chemistry? Will ultimately be a large control of the geochemistry in these systems. Biology, so these microorganisms that are there, how are they using the elements dissolved in this water to live? How are they transforming it? What are their waste products that might be introduced through their life activity? Also tying into this is hydrology, so where does the water flow? How fast is it flowing? That'll sort of control how much these interactions with the rocks can occur. So if you have a longer interaction time of the water with rock, you might leach more elements out versus a shorter interaction time, and also these flow paths, so what specific rocks does it interact with? And then also another factor is human influences, so this can include things on the surface, so are we doing things on the surface that might infiltrate down and influence the chemistry of these systems as well? But also, in this case, we're working in a former mine, so there's a lot of tunnels. They're doing excavations for all these awesome physics experiments going on here. And so that's going to influence the chemistry of the system as well. So we need to understand how our actions might be influencing this as well. So for understanding geochemistry, mines, former mines such as surf, provide a really awesome portal to be able to understand these. Because you can sample directly from water as it flows out of the rock. And so this is an image of one of the students who worked with me, Riley, collecting a sample as it flows out of the rock. And so this provides the ability to collect samples at a much higher spatial resolution than traditional techniques. So traditionally, the way we understand groundwater systems and the way most groundwater systems are understood is you dig a well into the ground and you analyze the water that comes up. And so that's really useful. It provides the foundation of what we know, but the downside to it is drilling wells, particularly to really deep depths, is expensive. And so you're not going to be able to get a super high spatial resolution. Whereas if we work in surf, and I'll discuss this a bit more later, there's a lot of tunnels and a lot of areas we can access, and so we can collect samples at much higher spatial resolutions. So we can collect water samples as close to meters apart from each other. And that's just not even possible at all using wells. But as I mentioned before, the downside using these settings is that they've been perturbed by humans. So if we're going to try and use these to understand natural systems, we need to be able to understand what these anthropogenic or human factors are. and how they affect the chemistry and the hydrology. So the title of my talk called this a natural lab, and I do think it is still a natural lab for a lot of reasons, but we also need to consider that we've modified it as well. Okay, so to talk about SURF specifically, and why it's so interesting for this work. So SURF is hosted within the former Homestake gold mine. It's comprised primarily of iron-rich metasedimentary rocks. And so on the right side of the image for you all viewing online, you can see a picture of the open pit. For you here with me in person, you can just look out the window back there. But I just want to demonstrate with this image that the geology here is pretty complex. So there's a lot of different units, there's a lot of dikes, cross-cutting relationships, things have been metamorphosed, and so it provides a lot of opportunity for water to interact with different rock types, which can provide us a lot of information as well. The other interesting aspect about this being a metasedimentary rock is that most groundwater studies focus on groundwater within sedimentary rocks. And that's because those are the most productive aquifers generally. And so if we're going to use this for human needs, these sort of sedimentary hosted groundwater systems are important. But these crystalline hosted, which means metamorphic or igneous rocks, comprise about a third of the groundwater systems on Earth. So understanding them is also important, and they've received relatively less study. So if we want to study groundwater, what makes SURF so great, and I alluded to this earlier, is that there's a lot of tunnels that allow you to access various places that you can sample, and allows us to sample water and its variability both laterally and with depth. And so the image in the middle here just shows a schematic diagram of all the different passages in SURF. This is from the entire time that the Homestake mine was operating. And so not all of this is accessible today, but there's still around 12 miles of shafts, drifts, and ramps. And so that's a lot of opportunity to get to different places to sample its variability. So sort of a primer on what's been done looking at groundwater at SURF previously. So this is a study done in 2012 where they did some modeling to try and understand the hydrology of SURF. So where's the water coming from? How old is the water? Things like that. And ultimately, the takeaway from this study was they identified two primary reservoirs of groundwater within the SURF system. And that's one that's more at shallower depths, and so that's shown by these pinkish and purple colors on the image here. Those are generally more recently derived from surface inflow, so less than 10 years old, so much younger waters. Whereas when you get deeper into the mine, we start getting into older waters that have had much longer subsurface storage. So they've been stored underground for hundreds to thousands or even longer time periods. It's not really well understood exactly how old this subsurface storage is, but suffice to say it's much older than the shallow influence. And so if we look at the schematic diagram here, in green we have the different mine workings. The yellow line is the 4850 level, and you can see depending on where you are within SURF, there will be variable influence of these different spheres of water. So nowadays, active pumping of water maintains the water table level to around 5,000 feet of depth. So what we're working in is the unsaturated zone, so it's not a continuous surface of water underground. It's sort of moving around through fractures. Some areas have water, some are dry. That may or may not change through time. During operation of the mine, they pump down to around 8,000 feet of depth. And then when they closed the mine, prior to the establishment of SURF, it was flooded up to about 4,100 feet of depth before they brought it back down to where it is today. And so all that just to point out that the water in the system has been modified a lot through time, but it sort of has hopefully reached an equilibrium at this point of what it is now. And I'll just point out, because I'm going to talk about some things that might not be particularly good to jump in or to pour out into the environment, is that all this pumped water is treated by the SURF wastewater treatment plant before it goes back out into the world. So no need to be concerned. They do a great job of making sure that they're good environmental stewards here. Okay, so to jump into the geochemistry of the water specifically, most of the geochemical work previously has been done as part of the Deep Mine Microbial Observatory, or DEMO. This is led by Maggie Osborne and her group out of Northwestern, who gave a really great talk a few months back about her research. So if you want more detail on this, I encourage you to seek that out. But what they do is they've identified a series of 6 sites where they've created these boreholes that they've modified to be able to do repeated sampling of things like geochemistry, and more importantly for them, the microbial communities that live there, to try and understand what the microorganisms are and how they're living. So part of that is to understand how they're living is you need to understand the geochemistry of these environments. So they monitor geochemistry through time. This is data from a paper they put out in 2019, where they collected data from these 6 sites over a 2-year period at about 2 to 3 month intervals. And so what these plots show is the geochemistry of these sites. And so on the top, there's these 2 triangles. So these are ternary diagrams that just show the relative abundance of different ions. So on the left, we have the relative abundance of our cations, and on the right, the relative abundance of our anions. And long story short, things that plot more closely to each other in this space are more similar to each other. Things that plot further away are more different than each other. And the interesting takeaway from this is that each of these individual sites plots much more closely to each other than to the other sites. And that shows that each of these sites have a distinct geochemistry. The other interesting aspect of this is that it's relatively stable throughout time. And so this table on the bottom here shows their different sites and the different depths where they're at. And then the conductivity measurement, so that's just a measure of the total amount of things that are dissolved in solution. I'll provide a bit more detail on that later. But basically, higher numbers indicate more things dissolved in solution, lower numbers, less things. And so the number on the left is the mean value over this 2-year period. And the number on the right is the standard deviation over that period. And so you can see these standard deviations are really small, which suggests that the geochemistry is really stable throughout time. And so they were able to sort of tie some of the relationships they saw to what rock types they're in, how deep they are, to sort of understand it. But there's not really a great mechanistic understanding of what controls geochemistry as we move throughout the system. And so that's sort of where my interest comes in. So it's sort of a small world. So I actually saw Maggie and some of her students talk about this research when I was in grad school and found it a really interesting system. This was well before I ever thought I would move to South Dakota. And then when I moved out here, it's like, well, I need to do something at SURF. It's a really awesome place. And it took about 4 years, but finally last year we were able to get a project going. So long term, what I'm interested in is trying to develop a mechanistic understanding of what controls geochemistry at SURF. So going back to that schematic diagram I showed earlier, can we sort of quantify the different influences of biology, hydrology, geology, all those sorts of different things? So that's a much longer term goal. The shorter term goal of this project was to get a research project started at SURF. SURF makes that fairly easy and painless, so I worked with them to get this project going, and then to collect new geochemical data to sort of augment what was available previously. So what we did was last year, we went underground monthly from August to December of last year and collected geochemical samples from some additional sites that had not been explored previously. And so what we focused on was water coming out of fracture-hosted drips. And so what I mean by that is just where water is dripping directly out of the surface of the walls or ceiling of the passages. And so this is slightly different than the borehole samples previously. So that's sort of one thing we can compare and contrast. And then we collected sort of a full suite of geochemical data. So that's sort of my day job at School of Mines, is running different instruments to be able to do these analyses. So we took them back and got a full elemental analysis of what was in our these different samples. And so we collected from 6 different sites, 1 on the 800 level, 4 on the 1700 level, and 1 on the 2000 level. And so levels just refer to the feet underground. So the 800 level is 800 feet underground. 1700 level is 1700 feet underground. Most people are familiar with the 4850, where most of the cool physics stuff is going on, but there's a lot of access in other sites as well. And so that's sort of what we focused on. Okay, so to jump into the results of our data, so this is similar to the plot I showed you earlier from the demo sites. So this just shows the major ion chemistry of our sites. So on the bottom left triangle, ternary diagram, this shows the relative abundance of our cations. On the right, the relative abundance of our anions, and in the middle, a composite of all of those. And again, things that plot more closely to each other are more similar to each other than things that plot more further apart. And we see sort of the same sort of stuff we saw in the demo samples, that each site tends to have a distinct major ion chemistry, and so each site has a distinct geochemistry. However, if we look at the temporal changes within this sites we sampled, we see that there's huge changes in the geochemistry with time. And so to sort of demonstrate that, this plot on the left side here is our conductivity measurement through time. As mentioned earlier, conductivity relates to the total concentration of ions in a solution. So it's how much a solution can carry an electrical charge. And if you have more things dissolved, you can carry more of a charge. So larger numbers is saltier, smaller numbers is less salty. And to give you a bit of a sort of way to orient yourself, seawater has a conductivity of 50 millisiemens per centimeter, and drinking water is typically 1.5 millisiemens per centimeter or less. So we're much less salty than seawater, but kind of above what most people would consider drinking water. So what we see here is interesting. So we see these large changes between sites. That's consistent with that major ion chemistry we saw. But we also see these huge changes through time as well. And the other interesting thing looking at this is that there's no clear trend with time between sites. So if we see a decrease in one site, we don't see a decrease in every site. Perhaps not super surprising, but it is somewhat interesting that there's no obvious linkage between how each of these different sites interact. And we're still dealing with a sort of small data set, but there's no obvious trend with depth. So our black dots down here are the 800 level. Those are our most dilute samples, but our 2000 level site, which is our deepest, is sort of intermediate. So there's no obvious depth trend either. So if we want to get at what's sort of controlling this conductivity changes, one thing we can do is look at what particular constituents are changing this conductivity. And so this sort of busy plot here is a correllogram, and this just shows the relationship between all of the different parameters we measured. This is sort of a trimmed down one of just sort of the major ions, so the most abundant things. And so the way to read this chart is on the left side are the different constituents in the water, and where things interact, so where things cross each other is the correlation between those, and the number is the R squared value. So things that are dark red have a really strong positive correlation. Things that are light red have a slight positive correlation. White colors means no correlation, and lighter blue colors means a slight negative correlation. And so the takeaway from here is if we look at conductivity on the right side here and the different parameters that are correlating most strongly with conductivity, we see that it correlates with calcium, magnesium, potassium, manganese, iron, and sulfate. And so if we look at just those cations specifically, that makes a lot of sense if we look at the mineralogy of our surf rocks. So here's the common minerals found without surf and their chemical formulas. And each of those different elements you can find within those rocks. And so it makes sense that what's controlling conductivity are these different parameters. But the interesting thing is there's this other, so our anion, sulfate, is not found in any of these minerals. So there is sulfur in pyrrhotite and pyrite, but it's not sulfate, so it's a different form of sulfur. So the question is, well then where is this sulfate coming from? So to sort of look at our sulfate data more specifically, so this is just our time series of sulfate again, and we see that sulfate concentrations are relatively high in some sites, so up to 25 millimolar, down to 0.4 millimolar. There's some temporal variability specifically within our 1700-2 site, but not a huge degree outside of that one data point. So where is this sulfate coming from? So there's a few different options where sulfate can come from in water systems. Most commonly, what sort of your first thought might jump to is sulfate minerals like gypsum. So this is calcium sulfate. This is a highly soluble mineral. If you live in the Black Hills, you can see this all over the place. So this is an image of the spearfish formation somewhere in the hills. And this lighter gray layer is this gypsum. So this is found all over the place. Here, but in the area surrounding surf and within surf particularly, there's some minor occurrences of gypsum, but not enough to really create these large concentrations we see. So I would cross that off the list as a possible source. The next option would be maybe it's just coming in with these recharged waters. So the waters just has high sulfate originally. That doesn't make a ton of sense if you look at the fact that we have low concentrations in some sites, but just to sort of explore what sulfate might be from these recharged waters. So if we look at precipitation in the Black Hills, there's not really any measurements close by, but I was able to find a study from Wind Cave where they measured sulfate and precipitation and found that it was around 5 micromolar. So we're looking at 25 millimolar, so 1,000-fold difference between the concentrations and precipitation and what we see in the surf waters. So I don't think precipitation is a good explanation for that. Another option would be that these surface waters, so while there might not be gypsum in the immediate area surrounding surf, as these streams and creeks flow into the area, maybe they interact with gypsum, and so they're high in sulfate. So if we look at results, so that's what this image on the left side is, from a USGS report where they measured sulfate from a bunch of different locations around the hills. And so we are here in the sort of bottom third bit in lead. And the size of these dots corresponds to the amount of sulfate in the samples they took. So the units are a little different, so I apologize for that. But basically, if it's a small dot, there's not a lot of sulfate in it. And so if you look at Whitewood Creek, which is just down the road here specifically, it has around 2.5 millimolar sulfate. So that can explain some of our lower concentration sites, but that's tenfold lower than what we see as our highest sulfate concentration. So I don't think surface recharge is a great explanation of this either. What I do think can explain this is the oxidation of sulfides or sulfide minerals, and that's because iron sulfides are abundant at surf. So this is an image of a rock from surf. All these gold crystals are pyrites. This is probably the bane of the existence of the miners back in the day. Pyrites known as fool's gold, and it's an iron sulfide mineral. And so sulfate can be generated from these iron sulfide minerals by oxidation. And so there's a bunch of iron sulfide minerals at surf. Like I mentioned, pyrite's probably the most common one, but there's some others, pyrrhotite and arsenopyrite as well. But up here on the top just shows the chemical equation for oxidation of pyrite. So FeS2 is our pyrite. It gets oxidized, in this case, by oxygen. Different oxidants can be used as well. But ultimately, regardless of the exact mineral, what you end up with is dissolved iron and sulfuric acid, so sulfate and acidity. And so this process can occur abiotically or be driven by microorganisms, so it can just happen if you have dissolved oxygen in your water, but microorganisms can also exploit this to be able to live. And there's been abundant evidence of microbial sulfide oxidation at surf. So this is part of Caitlin Kazar's work that was also part of Maggie Osborne's group, where they've demonstrated a lot of evidence for this sulfide oxidation. So I think it fits really well with the microbial story we know about already. And so this reaction, as I mentioned, generates sulfuric acid, which can in turn dissolve other minerals. And so this is an image of a fossil from a collection, I'm not exactly sure where, but this is a well-known problem with fossil collections. So a lot of fossils will have pyrite in them. And when they collect them, take them out of the ground, that pyrite will start to oxidize, produce the sulfuric acid, and it causes these fossils to break down. So you can sort of see how this fossil is just falling apart. So if we look at how that might interact with our rocks at surf, I think the sulfuric acid generation is in turn enhancing the dissolution of other minerals and driving the geochemistry we see. And so that's consistent with the strong correlation between sulfate and conductivity we see. So here we have conductivity on our x-axis, sulfate on our y-axis, and you can see the relationship between them. It has a high R² value, so there's a strong relationship between sulfate and conductivity. There's a bit of a gap in the middle here, so you could argue maybe there's two groups. I didn't have time to get into this talk, but if you look at, put the demo site data on here, it sort of fills in some of the gaps. So I think this is a pretty robust correlation. So the interesting thing is, if you buy that sulfate is being produced by the sulfide oxidation, we should have a lot of acidity, so a lower pH of our waters. But when we look at the measurements of pH we took when we were from our sites, most of these waters are circumneutral to alkaline, so pH of 6.8 to 8.2. And so that to me indicates, this provides additional evidence that this sulfate that's being produced by this pyrite oxidation, or the sulfuric acid, is being neutralized by the rocks and leaching out different minerals. And so I think this is sort of a feedback that drives our sort of overall trends in geochemistry, and then what specific elements are changing just depends on the mineralogy of the flow path and what the rock types these waters are interacting with. So the next aspect of this story is to look at the iron story. So if we're doing pyrite oxidation, as I mentioned, we should be getting a lot of dissolved iron as well. And so if we look at the relationship between iron and sulfate, so crossplot similar to what I showed you before, we see that there is a correlation between iron and sulfate. It's not as clear as we saw before. It seems like you actually reach like a threshold sulfate value before you get higher iron concentrations. But there is some relationship there. Now, the interesting thing about this is that based on the stoichiometry of that reaction I showed you previously, we should expect about 2 times as much sulfate as iron if our iron is coming from pyrite dissolution. And we don't see that here. So I'll note the differences in these different axes. So our iron is in micromoles, our sulfate is in millimoles, so our iron's 1,000-fold lower. And so these concentrations are much, much lower than we expected. And so that suggests that this iron, after it's being produced by this pyrite oxidation, is then sort of going on its own journey. And so for those of you who have spent time underground at SURF, this probably isn't particularly surprising to you, because there's abundant evidence of what happens to this iron, and that's in the form of these iron oxides and hydroxides that form these red rust-colored deposits that you see all over the place underground. So when iron is dissolved, it's in its iron 2+ state, and this can be oxidized into iron 3+, which is then insoluble and forms these mineral deposits. So like I mentioned, you can see this all over SURF. There's been previous evidence for microbial iron oxidation found in the genomes that have been sequenced from those demo sites as well. And so again, this fits nicely into the microbial story as well. And so to this point, I think this provides sort of a nice demonstration of how we can use this data to start to understand our geochemistry, and how it really is a feedback between geology, biology, hydrology, and all of these different factors, and how you can start to tease out these processes. So we're still pretty far from a mechanistic understanding, but we're starting to make some progress on what's controlling these different processes. However, if we start to look at our inter-site variability, so our changes with time, this relationship breaks down. So if we look at, this is that cross plot I showed you of conductivity versus sulfate earlier, but now each individual site is colored by its, and you can see these individual sites don't follow this trend at all. So the conductivity seems to be independent of sulfate in most of these cases. And so that suggests that there's an alternate control for this temporal variability. And so this sulfide oxidation maybe is relatively consistent through time and isn't controlling these conductivity changes we see. And so there's a lot of potential drivers of temporal variability. I won't delve too far in this, but just to sort of show some other data sets on how they change through time. So on the top left, we have our dissolved inorganic carbon. On the bottom left, we have our calcium concentrations, and on the right, pH. And so you can spend a lot of time, and this is what I do, is spend a lot of time looking at these data and trying to figure out how things piece together. But if you look at this, you can see there's very different trends between the different elements we're looking at. So DIC seems to have clear temporal trends that affect all sites equally. Calcium's all over the place. pH changes a little bit, but we don't see nearly as huge of swings as we do in other sites. And so I think if we're going to get at this temporal variability, we just need more data, ultimately. But there's a few things that could be potentially driving this. So things like mixing of additional water sources, or higher concentrations of some water sources, so maybe you have more recharge with higher rain events or something like that. Changes in the degree of microbial activity, so we do see temperature changes with time, so that might influence how quickly these microbes are able to metabolize things and could influence geochemistry. Or anthropogenic influences, so as I mentioned, they're doing a lot of excavation. So maybe there's things like changes in the ventilation or water pumping conditions that slightly alter these as well. So a lot of work left to do, but a lot of interesting observations to this point. So sort of just to quickly wrap up, hopefully you've taken away that groundwater SURF is a dynamic system, both spatially and temporally, and that makes it a really great place for us to try and use this as a model for understanding other systems on Earth or systems on other planets. So we see a high degree of spatial and temporal variability from these fracture-hosted drip sites. That's slightly different from what we saw in the previous data from borehole sites, which only saw this spatial variability. And I think we've identified this sulfuric acid production by sulfide oxidation as a major driver of this dissolution. But ultimately, we need a lot more data through space and time, and so that's I'm hoping to continue to work out here for years to come and collect a lot more data to help to better understand the system. So thank you all again for your time, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, any questions in the room?
Thank you so much, that was very interesting. One of the graphs that you showed was that change in time. Are you seeing similar patterns year after year, or was this a 1-year sampling?
Yeah, so this was just for 6 months of last year. So we don't have that sort of data, but that is one of the data sets we'd like to collect as a much longer time frame, because then you can really sort of back out controls a lot better when you have a larger time frame.
Do you have a prediction on whether you're going to see repeating patterns?
I would think that at least some of the sites that may be more influenced by the surface inflow might have repeating patterns associated with like rain events or things like that. I haven't really dug too deep into trying to tie it into precipitation events or things like that. But it's interesting that the borehole sites don't see this variability, so I don't really have a great prediction at this point.
Can I ask another one?
Sure.
So my second question, when you think about the biogeological chemical relationships, you talked a lot about sulfates. I'm very curious related to carbonates, carbon dioxide, carbon sequestration. And so could you speak to that at all?
Yeah, so well, a few things I can sort of jump back to the slide. So this is our DIC concentration. So this is the sum of all dissolved carbon. I think the fact that it's one of the few things that we see that shows trends throughout time suggests that maybe this is somewhat related to sort of ventilation sorts of things. So if you look at cave systems, they'll have natural ventilation and how much carbon's in them. So maybe there's natural changes, maybe it's things with how they're having to change airflow within the mine might be influencing that. And so to get to the carbon sequestration point, ultimately what controls whether the carbonates that they sequester is how much dissolved carbon you have. And so understanding how this changes through time is a big story. One other thing that I didn't talk about in this talk at all is we collected some of these sort of speleothem samples that you can see in the background here. So these are equivalent to the speleothems you see in caves, and looked at their chemistry, and they're made of calcium carbonate. So there's active carbonate precipitation occurring widespread throughout. So that's another part of the story. I know that's kind of all over the place, but hopefully that provided a little insight.
All right, any more questions in the room?
I just got one.
Sure.
So a lot of the data was taken from the 2,000 foot level up.
Yep.
Is there any look at trying to go deeper and out further into the workings and see if you can note any of the different change in geochemistry at those levels and further from, I don't know, where those relative to like the shafts and stuff like that, where it might be a less oxygen rich environment?
Yep, absolutely. So part of the future work is to just collect samples from all over the place, and that way we can start to place things spatially and really start to explore some of these spatial trends. We focused on the levels we did for a few reasons. One, the 1700 level hadn't been explored previously, and also some of it was just logistically easier to not be going down too far when they were doing all the excavation and those sorts of things. But longer term, we'd like to really get a wide berth of measurements.
All right, we have one online, which is any way to get iron out of the water naturally?
Well, so, and to some extent it is occurring naturally. So the iron's being oxidized, so that dissolved iron is precipitating out. And I don't think that's necessarily, I think that's just a natural occurrence. Yes, yep.
Any more questions in the room? Well, I have one. So if you are dreaming up your perfect lab, from the facility standpoint, so from biogeochemistry, what would you actually like in a facility like ours? Like access all the time to all the different levels, continuously monitoring, do you want sampling happening or analyzing underground, stuff like that?
So
dream big.
The ability to access a lot of different places, so more tunnels, more shafts, be able to get to different places would be really interesting. I haven't really talked too much about the possibility of doing this, but to be able to sample some of the saturated level of the groundwater table, so we're underneath where they're pumping, would be interesting as well. Setting up continuing monitoring for some parameters would be really interesting. I'm fortunate that I live really close here and that I run a lab that's close to here. The lab side of things I think is just as easy for us to take it out of underground, so I don't think we need like a huge lab facility, but the ability to sample more widely and more continuously would be really cool.
All right, cool. We will try. All right, any other questions? Okay, then let's thank the speaker again. then I have a different paper for that. So I just want to remind everyone that the next speaker or the next session of our Deeper Talks is on October 9, and that's with David Woodward. He's at Berkeley now, and he's going to talk about Lux Zeppelin dark matter experiments and mining for WIMPs. Of course, I can talk about that for a while, but we know all about dark matter. So we will hear more about LC and the latest results of LC next time. With that,
QR code will be up for survey.
There is a survey we want you to take part, and there's a QR code right now showing there, and it's out there at the door. Anything else I have missed? All right, thank you everyone. See you next time. Thanks. Bye.